The Panic Virus, a true story of medicine, science, and fear. By Seth Mnookin. Narrated by Dan John Miller. Copyright 2011 by Seth Mnookin. This unabridged audiobook is published by arrangement with Simon & Schuster, Incorporated, and was produced in the year 2011 by Tantor Media, Incorporated, which holds the copyright thereto. A lie will go round the world while truth is pulling its boots on. Proverb popularized by fundamentalist Baptist preacher Charles Haddon Spurgeon in an 1855 sermon, often attributed to Mark Twain. Cast of characters. Advocacy organizations. Autism 1, parent-led group that believes most cases of autism are caused by vaccines. Autism Research Institute, early autism advocacy organization founded by Bernard Rimland in 1967. Autism Speaks, largest autism charity in the country, founded by former NBC Universal chairman Bob Wright and his wife Suzanne in 2005. Cure Autism Now, founded in 1995 to fund research into autism, merged with Autism Speaks in 2006. Defeat Autism Now, offshoot of ARI, founded in 1995, emphasizes the use of non-standard treatments for autism. Generation Rescue, also known as Jenny McCarthy's autism organization, promotes the view that vaccines cause autism and other neurological disorders. National Alliance for Autism Research, founded in 1994 to fund scientific research into autism, merged with Autism Speaks in 2005. National Vaccine Information Center, founded in 1982 by parents who believed their children suffered brain injuries caused by the DPT vaccine. Safe Minds, founded in 2000 to fight against mercury-induced neurological disorders. Parents and family members. Lisa Ackerman, Executive Director of Talk About Curing Autism, introduced Jenny McCarthy to the autism advocacy movement. Sally Bernard, Mercury Mom, one of the leaders of Safe Minds, lead author of Autism, a novel form of mercury poisoning. Vicki DeBold, board member of the National Vaccine Information Center, director of Safe Minds. Barbara Lowe Fisher, president of the National Vaccine Information Center. Jane Johnson, co-managing director of the Thoughtful House Center for Children, director of the Autism Research Institute. Eric and Karen London, co-founders of the National Alliance for Autism Research. Jenny McCarthy, actress, believes vaccines caused her son's autism, promotes the use of gluten and dairy-free diets to cure autism. Lynn Redwood, Mercury Mom, one of the leaders of Safe Minds, collaborated with David Kirby on Evidence of Harm. Bernard Rimland, father of the modern-day autism advocacy movement. Allison Singer, former spokesperson for Autism Speaks, co-founder of the Autism Science Foundation. Bob and Suzanne Wright, founders of Autism Speaks. Katie Wright, daughter of Bob and Suzanne Wright. Doctors and researchers. Bob Sears, California-based pediatrician, author of The Vaccine Book. Mark Geyer, frequent expert witness in vaccine court lawsuits, collaborates with his son David Geyer on research papers on the dangers of vaccines. Jay Gordon, former pediatrician to Jenny McCarthy's son, Evan. Neil Halsey, director for the Institute for Vaccine Safety at Johns Hopkins University. Leo Kanner, Austrian psychiatrist, coined the term autism in a 1943 research paper. Arthur Krigsman, pediatrician, former colleague of Andrew Wakefield's, treated Michelle Cedillo. Paul Offit, pediatrician specializing in vaccines and immunology, vocal vaccine proponent. Andrew Wakefield, lead author of the 1998 paper hypothesizing a connection between the MMR vaccine and autism. Journalists and writers. Brian Deere, British investigative journalist, wrote a series of articles on Andrew Wakefield and his research into the MMR vaccine. Richard Horton, editor of The Lancet. David Kirby, author of Evidence of Harm, frequent contributor to The Huffington Post. Leah Thompson, reporter on the 1982 television special Vaccine Roulette. The Autism Omnibus Proceeding. Michelle Cedillo, autistic girl whose vaccine court claim was one of the 3 initial omnibus test cases. Teresa and Michael Cedillo, parents of Michelle Cedillo. Sylvia Chin Kaplan, lawyer for the Cedillo family. George Hastings, special master who presided over the Cedillo trial. Other. Richard Barr, British personal injury lawyer, worked with Andrew Wakefield on lawsuits related to the MMR vaccine. Mary Lateo, founder of the Morgellons Research Foundation. Laura Little, early 20th century anti-vaccine activist. Lorraine Pace, founder of the West Islip Breast Cancer Coalition. Introduction. On April 22, 2006, Kelly Lasik looked around her dinner table and smiled. Dan, her husband of 13 years, was there, along with the couple's 3 children, Ashley, Stephen, and Matthew. Kelly's parents had also come over. There was a father-daughter dance at the local church that evening, and Kelly and her dad were double dating with Dan and Ashley. As the 4 of them were getting ready to leave, Kelly couldn't resist needling her mother. "You're stuck with the boys," she said. "But don't worry, we won't be out too late." She kissed Stephen goodbye, and then bent down to say goodnight to Matthew. He was 3 years old, and Kelly marveled at how quickly he was growing up. It seemed as if it was only moments ago that he'd been an infant, and now he was already being toilet-trained. Dan and Kelly both agreed that it was adorable how proudly he announced that he had to go to the bathroom. For a brief moment, Kelly says, she wondered if Matthew was okay. He seemed a little out of sorts, and earlier that afternoon he'd complained of a sore throat, but then she figured he'd probably just tired himself out wrestling with his older brother. Kelly and Dan returned home that night around 8 o'clock. They'd barely walked in the door when Kelly's mother rushed over. "It's Matthew," she said. "He's running a fever, and his breathing seems a little shallow." The Lasiks realized right away that something was seriously wrong. "He was just sort of hunched over," Kelly says. "We didn't know what to do. Since there was no way to get in touch with Matthew's doctor, they decided to make the 10-minute drive from their home in Monroeville, about 15 miles east of Pittsburgh, to the Forbes Regional Campus of the Western Pennsylvania Hospital. When the Lasiks arrived at the emergency room, the attending physician told them there was nothing to worry about. In all likelihood, he said, Matthew had a case of strep throat. Worst case scenario, it was asthma. Regardless, they'd be home in no time. 2 hours later, they were feeling much less assured. Matthew's fever was still rising, and when a doctor tried to swab his throat, he began to choke. By 11 p.m., Matthew's temperature had risen to 104 degrees, and his breathing seemed to be growing shallower by the minute. It was around that time that a doctor the Lasiks hadn't met before walked over. He was older, probably in his 60s, Kelly thought, and as soon as he saw Matthew, he began to suck nervously on his teeth. He turned to the Lasiks. Had Matthew received all of his shots? Actually, Kelly said, he hadn't. Matthew had been born in March 2003, several years after rumors of a connection between autism and vaccines had begun to gain traction in suburban enclaves around the country. That May, Kelly's chiropractor warned her about the dangers of vaccines. "He asked if we were going to get Matthew vaccinated, and I said yes," Kelly says. "And then he told me about mercury. He said, 'There's mercury in there.'" Kelly had already heard rumors that the combined measles, mumps, rubella, MMR vaccine was dangerous, but this was something new. "He was really vocal about it causing autism. He said there was this big report over in Europe and blah, blah, blah. And I thought, well, I'm surrounded by people who have autistic children. What if this happened to Matthew?" If Kelly was unconvinced, the chiropractor said, she should make Matthew's pediatrician prove to her that the vaccines Matthew was scheduled to receive were 100% safe. "So that's what I did," Kelly says. "I asked my doctor if she could give me a label that says there's no mercury, and she said no. She said she wouldn't give it to me." It was as if, Kelly says, her pediatrician was hiding something. The doctor tried to tell Kelly that she would be putting Matthew at serious risk by not immunizing him, but Kelly says, "I don't think I heard anything else she might have said, quite honestly." At that point, I had lost faith. From that day forward, Matthew didn't receive any of his scheduled vaccinations, including one for a bacterial disease called Haemophilus influenzae type B, or Hib. Oftentimes, a Hib infection is not particularly threatening. If the germs stay in the nose and throat, it's likely the child won't get sick at all. But if the infection travels into the lungs or the bloodstream, it can result in hearing loss or permanent brain damage. Hib can also cause severe swelling in the throat due to a condition called epiglottitis, which, if not treated immediately, results in infected tissue slowly sealing off the victim's windpipe until he suffocates to death. As recently as the 1970s, tens of thousands of children in America had severe Hib infections each year. Many of those suffered from bacterial meningitis, and between 500 and 1,000 died. After the vaccine was put into widespread use, the disease all but disappeared in the United States. In 1980, approximately 1 in 1,000 children caught the disease. Today, fewer than 1 in 100,000 do. In fact, the vaccine had been so effective that out of everyone working in the Monroeville ER, the doctor who'd asked Kelly Lasik about her son's vaccine history was the only one who had been practicing long enough to have seen an actual Hib infection in a child. Until that night, Kelly had never given much thought to the potential repercussions of her decision not to have Matthew vaccinated. "I must have read somewhere that after he turned 3, he would have been okay for many of those diseases," she says. "I thought he was in the clear." She was wrong. "I've never seen a doctor panic so quickly," she says. If, as the doctor was all but certain was the case, Matthew had been infected, then everything that had been done to him in the hospital that night, the examinations, the swabs, the breathing treatments, had only served to further inflame his throat. It wasn't until Kelly saw her son's x-rays that she realized just how dire the situation was. It looked as if Matthew had a thumb lodged in his throat. "I started to shake," Kelly says. There was just a tiny bit of airway left for him to breathe. Within minutes, the entire emergency room was thrown into frenzy. Kelly heard someone shout out, "Page Children's!" Then she heard a second command, "Get Life Flight here right away!" Finally, a doctor pulled the Lasiks aside and explained the situation to them. "If we don't get Matthew in a helicopter to the Children's Hospital in Pittsburgh right now, your son is probably going to die," he said. "It could be within minutes." While they were waiting, the doctor said, Kelly had to make sure Matthew remained calm. "I do not want you crying," the doctor said. "I do not want you reacting to anything. If you are upset, Matthew will be upset, and that will make his throat close up more. If that happens, he will suffocate." As if in a daze, Kelly went and picked up her son. It wasn't until she heard her teeth chattering that she realized she was shaking. She focused all her energy on trying to remain still. While Kelly was holding Matthew, Dan Lasik was conferring with the hospital staff. It had rained earlier in the evening, and now the entire area was covered in fog, which made it too dangerous to land a helicopter. Matthew was going to have to make the trip to Pittsburgh in an ambulance, but before he could be moved, he'd have to be intubated. If that didn't work, if there was not enough room in Matthew's throat for a breathing tube, the doctors would try to perform a tracheotomy, which involves cutting into the windpipe in an effort to form an alternate pathway for air to get into the lungs. The procedure is not without risk. The physicist Stephen Hawking lost his speech when the nerves that control the vocal cords were damaged during an emergency tracheotomy. Once again, it fell to Kelly to keep her son calm. Fortunately, the tube slid down Matthew's throat. Unless it closed up so much that the tube was forced out, they'd bought themselves a few more hours. It was almost 4 a.m. when the Lasiks arrived in Pittsburgh. Matthew was immediately placed in a medically induced coma. All the doctors could promise was that he'd live through the night. "They said something about not catching it quickly enough with the antibiotics," Kelly says. "Even if he did recover, there was a good chance he would have permanent brain damage, or best case scenario, he would have hearing loss. For 48 hours, Dan and Kelly Lasic's son remained in stable condition. "You're in shock," Kelly says. "You never let your guard down. You're just so focused on him getting better." Then, on Tuesday, just as they were growing more hopeful, Matthew's blood pressure plummeted. The only thing the Lasics could think to do at that point was to ask their friends to pray for them. When Kelly Lasic's chiropractor told her that vaccines had been linked to autism, he was repeating the most recent of hundreds of years' worth of fears about vaccinations. The roots of this latest alarm dated back to 1998, when a British gastroenterologist named Andrew Wakefield claimed to have discovered a new gut disorder associated with the MMR vaccine and with autism. Wakefield based his conclusions on a case study of a dozen children who'd been brought to his clinic at the Royal Free Hospital in London. Almost immediately, Wakefield's research methods and his interpretations, which had been published in the medical journal The Lancet, came under fire. Wakefield's response was to appeal to the public rather than to his colleagues. The medical establishment was so determined to discredit him, he said, because he threatened their hegemony by taking parents' concerns seriously. The media took the bait, and despite Wakefield's lack of proof and his track record of dubious assertions and unverified lab results, they began churning out stories about how a maverick doctor was trying to protect innocent children against corrupt politicians and a rapacious pharmaceutical industry. Within months, vaccination rates across Western Europe began to fall. Then, a year later, the Centers for Disease Control and Prevention, CDC, and the American Academy of Pediatrics, AAP, publicly recommended the removal of a widely used mercury-based preservative called thimerosal from childhood shots. The move had been hotly debated. In the end, one of the factors that had tipped the balance was a concern that following the Wakefield brouhaha, any connection, real or rumored, between vaccines and neurodevelopmental disorders had a chance of unraveling public confidence in vaccines. That fear proved to be well-founded, in no small part because of the growing hold autism had on the public's consciousness. In the half-century since infantile autism had been defined as a discrete medical condition, it had gone from being a source of shame for parents, who were blamed for their children's conditions, to becoming a seemingly omnipresent concern, especially among those well-educated upper-middle-class families for whom child-rearing had become an all-encompassing obsession. In spite of this increased attention, researchers were barely any closer to understanding autism's origins or devising effective therapies for its treatment than they had been in the past. For parents of autistic children, this lack of reliable information resulted in feelings of hopelessness and frustration. For parents in general trying to determine the best course of action for the future, it fueled a sense that medical experts and health authorities couldn't be counted on to look out for their family's well-being. Together, these reactions prepared the ground for new hypotheses to take root, regardless of how speculative or scientifically dubious they were. In the year following the CDC-AAP recommendations regarding thimerosal, a small group of parents decided that some of the symptoms of mercury poisoning seemed to match the behavior they saw in their autistic children, and they suddenly realized that their children had appeared to be fine before they'd received their vaccines. These parents began posting their observations online, sparking hundreds more parents to confirm that they'd noticed the exact same thing. With a network of non-traditional doctors and alternative health practitioners urging them on, they became more and more convinced that the common threads that ran through their stories were too odd and too widespread to be mere happenstance. The more these newly politicized parents learned, the more outraged they became. Why were children with weak immune systems injected with vaccines just as potent as those used on children in perfect health? Why was everyone instructed to receive the same number of inoculations, regardless of their medical histories or family backgrounds? Why, for that matter, were more and more shots being added all the time? Was a chickenpox vaccine really necessary, or one for the flu? Just as had been the case with the MMR vaccine, there was no concrete evidence linking thimerosal to autism, and the anecdotal corroboration often seemed more impressive than it actually was. To take but one example, despite superficial similarities, the motor difficulties exhibited by people with mercury poisoning bear little resemblance to the repetitive movements typical of autistics. That didn't stop the American media from reacting much the same way their colleagues across the Atlantic had when Wakefield published his assertions, as the emotional pull of stories featuring sick children and devoted parents outstripped anything as boring as hard data or the precautionary principle. In a matter of months, an ad hoc coalition of Mercury moms transformed itself into a potent political force. Senators spoke at their rallies, public health officials tried to assuage their concerns, and federal agencies included them in discussions on how to spend tens of millions of dollars. Soon, vaccination rates began to fall in the United States as well. By the beginning of the new millennium, Wakefield supporters and the proponents of the thimerosal link had joined forces to create an international cadre of vaccine skeptics whose message had an undeniable appeal. Parents trying to do nothing so much as raise their children had been taken advantage of by a society they trusted, and now they were determined to make it right. Over the past 2 decades, the instant accessibility of information has dramatically reshaped our relationship to the world of knowledge. 500 years after Gutenberg's introduction of the printing press and Martin Luther's translation of the Bible let common people bypass the priestly class, the vernacular of 24-hour news channels and internet search engines is freeing us to take on tasks that we'd long assumed were limited to those with specialized training. Why, after all, should we pay commissions to real estate brokers or stock analysts when we can find online everything we need to sell our houses or manage our investments? And why should we blindly follow doctors when we can diagnose our own ailments? One of the first effects of this hyper-democratization of data was to unmoor information from the context required to understand it. On the Internet, facts flow about freely and are recombined more according to the preferences of intuition than the rules of cognition. Mercury is toxic, toxins can cause development disorders, mercury is in vaccines. Ergo, vaccines cause autism. Combined with the self-reinforcing nature of online communities and a content-starved, cash-poor journalistic culture that gravitates toward neat narratives at the expense of messy truths, this disdain for actualities has led to a world with increasingly porous boundaries between facts and beliefs, a world in which individualized notions of reality, no matter how bizarre or irrational, are repeatedly validated. Take the birther movement, which contends that Barack Obama was born in Kenya and therefore is not eligible to be president. In the summer of 2009, Orly Taitz, a Russian-born dentist, lawyer, real estate agent, almost single-handedly turned her one-woman media blitz into a national preoccupation. Taitz, who believes that the Federal Emergency Management Agency is building internment camps to house anti-Obama activists, and that Venezuelan President Hugo Chavez controls the software that runs American voting machines, makes for undeniably good television. She looks like a young Carol Channing, sounds like an overexcited Zsa Zsa Gabor, and has the ability to make absurd accusations with a completely straight face. By midsummer, Taitz was appearing regularly on CNN, Fox News, and MSNBC, a decision the news channels justified with the risible pretext of needing to be fair to those on both sides of an issue about which there was nothing up for debate, at least not in the real world. Before long, mainstream on-air personalities like Lou Dobbs were pimping the story as hard as Taitz or any of her allies were, to equally comical effect. This type of cognitive relativism, or truthiness, as fictional talk show host Stephen Colbert termed it, has become the defining intellectual trend of our time. Colbert coined truthiness as a way to define former President George W. Bush's disdain for those who think with their head as opposed to those who know with their heart. Its pervasiveness was most tragically illustrated in Iraq. By inventing a set of facts to support the overthrow of Saddam Hussein, The Bush administration changed a discussion of whether Iraq had weapons of mass destruction to whether the theoretical presence of WMDs was sufficient justification for war. In the fall of 2004, after both WMDs and Easy Victory were revealed as mirages, a presidential aide made an astounding admission to the New York Times magazine. The White House, he said, didn't waste time worrying about those in what we call the reality-based community, who believed that solutions emerge from your judicious study of discernible reality. That, the aide said, is not the way the world really works anymore. When we act, we create our own reality. Orly Taitz couldn't have put it any better herself. My interest in the controversies surrounding childhood inoculations began in 2008. My wife and I were newly married, and though we didn't yet have children, we found ourselves initiates in a culture in which people obsessed over issues about which we'd previously been unaware, such as the political implications of disposable diapers and the merits of home births. Another common preoccupation, we discovered, was the fear that widespread fraud was being perpetrated by the medical establishment. These people were our peers. They gravitated toward fields like journalism or law or computer programming or public policy. They lived in college towns like Ann Arbor and Austin or sophisticated urban centers like Berkeley and Brooklyn. They drove Priuses and shopped at Whole Foods. They tended to be self-satisfied and found it almost impossible to conceive of a world in which their voices were not heard. They took pride in being intellectually curious, thoughtful, and rational. And we soon learned a good number of them didn't trust the American Medical Association, AMA, or the American Academy of Pediatrics, or at least didn't trust them enough to adhere to their recommended immunization schedules, which included vaccinations for diphtheria, hepatitis B, Hib, influenza, measles, mumps, pertussis, pneumococcal, poliovirus, rotavirus, rubella, and tetanus, all in the first 15 months of a child's life. This caught us by surprise. The AAP wasn't high on the list of organizations we thought likely to be part of a widespread conspiracy directed against the nation's children. That fall, we were at a dinner party when the subject of vaccines came up for what felt like the millionth time. I asked the parents at the table how they went about making decisions concerning their children's health. Did they talk to their pediatricians, other parents? Were they reading books, poking around online? One friend, a 41-year-old first-time father, said there was so much conflicting information out there, he hadn't known what to do. In the end, he said, he and his wife decided to delay some shots, including the ones for the MMR vaccine, which he'd heard was particularly dangerous. I don't know what to say, he told me. It just feels like a lot for a developing immune system to deal with. Note, this character and the subsequent conversation is drawn from an amalgam of discussions I had over a period of several months. These quotes represent my best recollection. As a rule, I try to avoid taking notes during dinner parties. At the time, I had no idea what the evidence supported. Still, I cringed when my friend said he'd made his decision based on what he felt, rather than by trying to assess the balance of the available evidence. Anecdotes and suppositions, no matter how right they feel, don't lead to universal truths. Experiments that can be independently confirmed by impartial observers do. Intuition leads to the Flat Earth Society and bloodletting. Experiments lead to men on the moon and microsurgery. The more I pushed my friend, the more defensive he grew. Surely, I said, there had to be something tangible, some experiment or some epidemiological survey that informed his decision. There wasn't. I was even more taken aback when he said he likely would have done the same thing, even if he'd been presented with conclusive evidence that the MMR vaccine was safe. Let's say that there haven't been any studies that have uncovered a problem, he said. That doesn't mean they won't find one someday. He was, of course, technically correct. It is always impossible to prove a negative. That's why gravity is still a theory, and why you can't prove with absolute certainty that I won't wake up tomorrow with the ability to fly. As Einstein said, no amount of experimentation can ever prove me right. A single experiment can prove me wrong. Finally, he offered up this rationalization. If everyone agreed that vaccines are so safe, we wouldn't even be having this discussion. By that point, my wife was kicking me under the table. I let the subject drop. But when I got home that night, I couldn't stop thinking about that conversation. The issue didn't affect me directly.
Sample complete. Ready to continue?